I realized I was no longer the only one standing in the middle, far too late. The sign did not come from the red thread, nor from a fracture. It came from something else entirely, an unnatural smoothness. A rift that should have howled did not. A deviation that should have drawn hunters did not. An overlap that should have been flattened by heaven's register was left untouched. Everything had been handled cleanly, too clean. I stood at the edge of a newly formed fracture, small, precise, leaving no scar. The two sides did not merge, yet they did not tear at each other either. Someone had stood here before me, and had followed the procedure perfectly. I knelt and placed my hand on the ground. There was no residual trace of my anchor. But there was something else, colder, not the cold of the outside, the cold of imitation. "You're late," a voice said behind me. I turned. He stood there, a humanoid outline, unstable, as if drawn and erased repeatedly. On his wrist was something resembling a red thread, but it wasn't a thread. It was a bound concept. "I learn quickly," he said. "You made a very clear example." I didn't step back. "What are you?" He tilted his head. The motion was off. "I was hunger," he said. "Then I was a hunter. Now I'm trying to be the middle." My heart sank. This was what the old rule had never warned about. Outside the register, things could evolve through observation. "Have you seen the consequences?" I asked. He looked at the sealed fracture. No deaths, no locking, no scars. Very efficient. I shook my head. "No scars means no memory," I said. "You didn't heal it. You erased the lesson." He was silent for a few seconds. Then he smiled. This time he had teeth. "Lessons are what make fractures return," he said. "I'm better than you. I make them forget pain." That was when I understood. He wasn't breaking balance. He was flattening it completely. A world without records, an outside without hunger, a middle that no longer needed anyone to stand in it. It sounded ideal. In truth, it was a world with no ability to self-correct. The red thread on my wrist trembled violently, not as a warning, but as a comparison. "You'll get tired," he said. "You'll make mistakes." "I won't, because I don't feel pain." I looked at him for a long time. Then I said quietly, "You've never lost anything." He froze, didn't argue, didn't understand. "The one who walks between," I continued, "has to bear misalignment so the world can remember. You're just cleaning rot to hide the smell." The air contracted around us. Not a clash, but two incompatible modes of existence. He stepped back. "I won't kill you," he said. "Not yet. You'll replace yourself." He dissolved, not vanished, but spread thin across space, like an algorithm being deployed. Behind me, the fracture did not close. It waited, as if deciding whom to call next. The old rule's voice echoed, heavier than before. "This has never happened. The walker between has been copied." I tightened my wrist. Another filament of the red thread snapped. Not many, but enough. The coming conflict wouldn't be about strength. It would be about this. Does the world need someone to stand between, or just something that makes all deviation disappear? I turned away. Because I knew anything that does things right without paying the cost will eventually do something catastrophically wrong. And this time on a scale that cannot be repaired. The name did not appear the way I expected. Not in a book, not in a ritual, not from the mouth of someone who truly knew whom they were calling. It appeared in rumors. At first, it was only a vague phrase. There is someone who stands in between. Then it became, there is someone who keeps things from overflowing. Finally, one night in a closed group, someone wrote, "The Keeper of Deviations." Just 3 words. But the moment I read them, the red thread around my wrist tightened sharply. It didn't hurt. It was being pulled into shape. A name is a kind of anchor. Not as powerful as heaven's register, not as crude as what exists outside it, but dangerous precisely because it is believed by many at once. I felt the change immediately. New fractures stopped calling me. They waited, not proactive, not chaotic, as if they were waiting for the correct role to arrive. On the human side, things changed too. People no longer acted randomly. They waited for signs. Some even began leaving deliberate gaps, not praying, not fixing, just to see whether the Keeper of Deviations would come. I stood on the edge of another city, looking down at hundreds of possible misalignments. If I went, I would confirm the name. If I didn't, the name would force reality to fit it. Anyway, the old rule's voice echoed, low and slow. A name simplifies. When there is a name, the world will force you to become it. I understood. A walker between is a state, but the Keeper of Deviations is a function. Once a function stabilizes, the world begins to demand performance. I felt the imitator. He did not resist this name. He supported it. Because a named role is far easier to replace than a state that cannot be called. If I accepted the name, he only had to keep deviations better. If I rejected it, humans would create another version, rougher, more incorrect. I stood there for a long time. Then I did something no one expected. I didn't erase the name, and I didn't accept it. I destabilized it. I began to appear wrong relative to expectations. Small deviations, I didn't come. Large deviations, I came, but didn't fully fix them. Places where people waited, I arrived too early. The meaning of Keeper of Deviations began to slip. People argued, that's not how the rumors described him. He doesn't keep things stable. He just makes everything harder to predict. Exactly. The name started losing its grip. The red thread on my wrist changed again. Not darker, but spreading, like ink dissolving in water. It was no longer a thread. It was a trace of existence. The old rule spoke again, this time with a hint of acknowledgement. You are doing something dangerous. I nodded. If the world needs a name, I will make sure it cannot use it. Far away, the imitator showed irritation for the first time. He didn't understand. Because the thing he was best at, optimization, stability, repetition, did not work on something that deliberately slipped meaning. I knew clearly, from now on, the hunt would no longer target me as an individual. It would target the meaning I refused to fix. And that is the most dangerous kind of hunt. The reaction didn't come from heaven's register, nor from outside it. It came from the crowd. When the Keeper of Deviations became unreliable, the world did the simplest thing. It found someone else. That person appeared very quickly, not by self-proclamation, but by being pushed upward. In a coastal city where boundaries constantly wavered with tides and old memories, a man began to succeed. Where there were fractures, he arrived. Where there were deviations, he fixed them. Fast, decisive, with clear results. No scars, no arguments. People called him the true keeper. When I heard that name, the trace on my wrist did not move. Not because it was irrelevant, but because the world was trying to remove me from the equation. I went to the places where he had intervened. They were clean, too clean. The fractures were fully closed. but the ground there had lost its elasticity, like a joint forced into the correct position too many times. The man stood in the square, very ordinary, no marks, no threads, no signs of being outside the register, but around him, everything was smooth to a frightening degree. "You're late," he said when he saw me. "People don't need you anymore." No provocation, no hostility, just a statement. "How do you fix things?" I asked. He shrugged. "I give them what they want. Stability. Results? No pain." I looked at the people around us. They were relieved, grateful, but their eyes had lost depth. "Do you know what you're doing?" I asked. He was silent for a moment, then answered honestly, "No, but it works." That was the dangerous part. Not that he was fake, but that he was accepted by the world. At the edge of perception, I felt the imitator. He no longer needed to appear. He had found a better method than copying me, not imitating the walker between, but creating a version humans liked more. The old rule whispered, barely audible, "You are being replaced." I nodded. "I know." "You could stop him." I shook my head. "If I stop him, I confirm there is only one correct way." I stood in that square for a long time. Then I did something no one understood. I intervened incorrectly, not destroying, not fixing. I created a small deviation, just enough to expose a limit. That night, a collective dream appeared. Not a nightmare, just a dream. No one could fully remember. The next morning, people began arguing over very small things, not violently, but without resolution. The true keeper returned. He fixed it, very quickly. But each time, he stayed a little longer. He began to tire, not physically, but because the world demanded he be perfect forever. I stood at the edge. I didn't save him. I didn't stop him. Because this was something he had to understand himself. Perfect, scarless stability requires constant maintenance. Scarred deviation sustains itself. When he looked at me again, his eyes had changed. No more confidence, no more certainty. "You knew this would happen," he said. I nodded. The world hates instability. But it hates even more being dependent on something that is always stable. The trace on my wrist faded slightly, not because it weakened, but because its reason for existence had been proven. Far away, the imitator began restructuring himself, because for the first time, the better version model couldn't last. And I knew this conflict would not end with who was right. It would end when the world accepted that there is no permanent solution. The true keeper collapsed, not in a single moment, but through many small corrections. At first, he was just more tired. Then he began to forget, not how to fix things, but why he had to fix them. On his 17th intervention that day, he stood inside a fracture without sensing the boundary. He fixed it out of habit, and that created a larger deviation. The fracture didn't open, didn't scream, didn't call. It silently swallowed. A neighborhood lost the ability to dream for 3 consecutive nights. No nightmares, no good dreams, just sleep that went nowhere. People became afraid, not of what lay outside the register, not of heaven's register, but of the feeling. Everything is correct, but I am no longer inside it. They came back looking for me, not through rituals, not through names, but through deliberate deviations. Small, clumsy, painful fractures appeared scattered everywhere. Not to beg, but to test whether I still existed. I felt them, and I knew, if I responded to all of them, I would walk his path. I had to choose. And this time, the price was personal. I ignored one fracture, just one, in a place very familiar, the old village road near the riverbank. The fracture was small, but it was tied to my memory. I could have stood between, easily, but I didn't. That night, someone in the village couldn't remember me. Not gradual forgetting, but as if they had never known me. The next morning, my mother looked at me for a long time. No confusion, no suspicion, just politeness. Who are you looking for? The trace on my wrist faded noticeably. Not torn, not painful, but missing a layer. That was the price. Not because I did wrong, but because I couldn't keep everything. The old rule spoke again, no longer distant. You are losing your anchor. I nodded. Humans cannot be protected by holding on to everything. A walker between must accept being erased piece by piece. I left the village before the sun rose too high. I didn't look back, because looking back is a form of clinging. In the city, the true keeper disappeared. Not dead, not hunted, just no longer awaited. The world had learned its hardest lesson. Perfect stability removes the self. Scarred deviation preserves humanity. But that cost is not free. It took from me the ability to be remembered. The trace on my wrist was now only a faint shadow. I knew if I continued walking between, I would lose more. Name, face, relationships. Eventually, perhaps even the concept of me. And that was what the imitator never understood. He wanted to replace a role. I was paying with myself. I realized I was nearing the threshold on a very ordinary morning. I stood at a roadside drink stall. The vendor looked at me, nodded out of habit, then froze. Her eyes went blank for a breath. Sorry, who are you? Not the first time, but the first time it didn't hurt. No cutting sensation, no sharp pain, just an empty space, quickly filled with acceptance. I paid, drank, left, without leaving a trace. The existence mark on my wrist was nearly transparent now. Even I wasn't sure it was still there unless I looked closely. The old rule once said, when no one remembers, the anchor dissolves. But my anchor hadn't dissolved. It no longer clung to others' memories. It clung to consequences. I existed because there were still places that could not connect. And then, Heaven's register reacted. It didn't record. It didn't erase. It hesitated. For the first time, I felt the delay clearly. A massive fracture formed at the northern boundary of the city, large enough that it should have been sealed immediately. But no entry appeared, no response. As if Heaven's register could not determine whether I still belonged in the equation. I stood watching the fracture from afar. I didn't step in right away, because I understood if I intervened now, I would do something unprecedented. Intervene without a valid identity. At the edge of perception, the imitator appeared, unclear, unstable. For the first time since meeting him, he couldn't hold his form. You are disappearing, he said. That isn't in the model. I looked at him. Because you always assume that someone must do the work. If no one does, he hesitated. There are still consequences, I replied. He was silent for a long time, not thinking, but lacking data. If you disappear completely, he said, the role will be empty. I nodded, and the world will have to stand between itself. The space around him shook violently, not from fear, but from a foundational contradiction. The imitator exists to optimize roles. I was proving that roles do not require permanent holders. I cannot replace you, he said slowly. That was the first time he admitted a limit. Not because he was weak, but because what he wanted to replace was dissolving out of form. I walked toward the fracture. I didn't stand between. I didn't call a name. I was simply there. The fracture shrank on its own. Not clean, not perfect, but sufficient. Heaven's register recorded a strange line. No name, no subject, just a note. Deviation self-adjusted. When I turned back, the imitator had retreated far away. He hadn't vanished, but I knew. He was afraid. Because for the first time, there was a good outcome that could not be copied. Not because of technique, but because there was no one left to imitate. I left. No one saw me off. No one called my name. And I understood clearly, if I continued, there would come a time when even I would no longer remember who I was. But in exchange, the world would learn its most important lesson. Not every moment needs someone to stand between. It only needs not to push deviation so far that it cannot return on its own. I began to forget. Not the things I had done, but the feeling of doing them. I remembered that I had once stood between, blocked, endured pain, but I no longer remembered why I had chosen that path then. That was the final sign. Not when others forgot me, but when I began slipping away from myself. The trace on my wrist was now only a faint glimmer, like the last reflection of something that once existed in water. If I walked between a few more times, that trace would dissolve completely, leaving nothing, no heaven's register, no outside the register, not even a fracture left to call a name. I went to a place with no deviation, land so flat, it required no intervention. I sat down. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't waiting for a fracture to appear. When there was nothing left to do, memories surfaced. Not many, just one. I saw myself as a child, sitting behind my father on an old motorbike. The village road was rough. The wind cut into my face. I don't remember where we were going. I don't remember the day. But I remember one feeling clearly: safety. Not because the world was stable, but because someone in front was taking responsibility for the road. I understood. That was the last remaining mark. Not a name, not a role, but the reason I had once stood between. Not to be correct, not to fix the world, but so that someone else could keep moving forward without fear of getting lost right now. The old rule spoke, very close now. You still hold one anchor, but only one. Keep it, and you will remain someone. Release it, and you will dissolve, and no one will wait. I looked at my wrist. The trace trembled lightly, as if awaiting a decision. If I kept that anchor, I would still be called, even without a name. If I let go, the imitator would have nothing left to fear. Humans would have no one to wait for, and the world would have to learn how to fall and stand up on its own. I stood up, not in a hurry, because this choice didn't need the right timing, only the right nature. I placed my hand over my wrist. I didn't pull, I didn't cut, I only whispered, not toward anyone. I do not keep this to be remembered. I keep it so as not to betray the original reason. The trace stopped dissolving. It didn't grow stronger. It didn't stabilize. It remained, just enough not to vanish. At that exact moment, a distant fracture closed on its own. Not because I arrived, not because anyone fixed it, but because it had deviated just enough to return. I smiled, not with joy, not with sadness, just right. At the edge of perception, the imitator receded fully into shadow. He wasn't defeated. He simply no longer had anything to replace. I walked on, no direction, no destination, I will still appear when there is a place that cannot stand by itself. But I will not stay, I will not be awaited, I will not be called. Only a trace faint enough for the world to learn to take responsibility for its own deviations.